I would say within the different ayahuasca cultures themselves, this is a big question. So one time I saw I was in it's not called it's called a work, I believe, by the União da Vegetal, which is the largest church in Brazil. It's not so well known, but it's quite large, and it's very, very different from anything that we can imagine around ayahuasca. They have something that looks more like a sort of Socratic dialogue. They drink ayahuasca and they speak mostly, and they speak about quite deep stuff, sometimes very spiritual, sometimes very philosophical. And people ask questions of the mestre, who's the man who runs the session. And one time a man asked, mestre, how can we tell the difference between the true intuition and the voice of our ego? Which is, it's sort of, I think it's where it's where this thing goes. The problem, quote unquote, is that, yes, it looks like ayahuasca is telling you things. But when ayahuasca tells you things, accepting that happens, or when you're just thinking out loud in your head, you're talking to yourself, it sort of sounds exactly the same. It's just a voice in your head saying things. This is also what this man was asking at the UDV session. I had an idea inside of me, something, I had a notion, an insight. How do I know if this is, valid and true intuition, or is actually just the voice of my ego? Because it actually sounds the same. It's just a voice in your head saying something, right? And basically, the answer of the mestre, which I think it's sort of also a universal answer, it is also the path that I follow myself in these circumstances when I have the same doubts myself. I've had, nights when ayahuasca has told me things that about what I should do with my life, which I didn't know whether to believe or not. And they were quite extreme. They would say, this would never work, or you should, stop all relationships with this person. And then you're like, oh, should I do this or shouldn't I do this? Is this true insight, or is this just my fears that was in my ego? What the mestre said, the answer that he gave was that indeed, these two things are the same, sound the same. They're not the same, but they can sound the same. And the process of learning to discern one from the other is the work itself. That's what you are going to learn to do. The way that he presented it, and I think it's a very, very useful metaphor that I've also heard in other places. It's a notion of transparency. So in order to be able to actually receive, let's call it, messages from the spiritual world or from a higher self, or the voice of your true intuition, if for people that are uncomfortable with all of these things, it's okay. The way to separate, the good insights from the, fear, ego, etc., is to become so transparent that whatever messages come from that place, which is very deep, are not sort of twisted so the work itself is one of transparency, is one of getting out of the way. And that means working on your anger, on your jealousy, on your ego, on your vanity. And these are all the things that will sort of, color or shape whatever sort of higher knowledge one is trying to attain. And it's in this process of becoming transparent that one can trust more and more the messages. And if one is not transparent, then actually these messages can often become, and people get very confused, and they, ayahuasca, I will give you, just an example. Is a true story from a mestizo community, and it was about a man in Peru. It was a man who's in the jungle, and it was a man whose son disappeared. He was an 8-year-old boy, and one day he didn't come back. And it was 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. And the father was really worried, and he decided to drink ayahuasca to see what happened with his son. And he drank ayahuasca, and ayahuasca told him that his neighbor had killed his son. So the next morning he went and killed his neighbor. And 2 days later, his son reappeared. He had gotten lost in the jungle, and there he was. So ayahuasca, ayahuasca told me there's I would say the science and the art of drinking ayahuasca has to do with how one deals with this, how one learns to deal with what ayahuasca tells you. Now, usually in places that have a strong tradition of use, they have quite good techniques around this and sort of tips and knowledges. Like I gave the example of the União da Vegetal. The União da Vegetal as a church, I think is about 60 years old. But so that supposedly it's much older, but let's just see, it's been incorporated as a church 60 years since it was refounded in Brazil. So that's at least 6 decades actually thinking about this. Thousands of people, and they have developed, and so have the indigenous groups, and so have I find this becomes a bigger problem as we get further and further from the source and farther from the traditions. And there you have people, or we have a tendency to take everything at face value, when in reality it could be that ayahuasca speaks in truths that are not necessarily physical truths, but that they are internal truths. So ayahuasca doesn't tell you to quit your job. Ayahuasca tells you that you hate your job. This, another, person I have a lot of respect for, told me that messages from the spiritual world never come as orders. Never. If you receive it as a sort of, you have no choice but to do this or that, then it's probably not coming from the spiritual world, because the spiritual world always presents choices. So you will see that very often some of the strongest visions that you will have, some of the strongest visions that I've had, actually presented themselves as a choice. I was faced with someone and I had to choose whether to engage with it or not, whether to take the gift that was offered or not, whether to accept or not, whether to engage or not. If I was not told, you have to do this or you have to do that. I was presented with a choice. That, for example, is also sort of a good rule of thumb for discernment. But again, it's, I think what you ask, I myself struggle with this. We all do. I mean, this is the toughest. This is the real. This is the work.